What is philosophy? Frank Thilly. During the first third of the past century, the intelligence of the world honored philosophy as the queen of science. In Germany, the capital of higher learning, students crowded into the lecture rooms of the philosophers and accepted their teachings as gospel truths. Everywhere, the deepest interest was manifested in the solution of the great problems of life. A powerful longing seized mankind to unravel the world's profoundest mysteries, and this longing, too impetuous to linger over an examination of the facts, satisfied itself in the study and production of metaphysical systems. A suggestive example of the immense influence wielded by the royal science during this epoch is furnished by the experience of Friedrich Vischer, who declared that the entire time and energy of his youth were devoted to the interpretation of the world riddle. "Indeed, it seemed to me in those days," he adds, "that a man had not attained his majority, and ought not, therefore, to be allowed to marry until he had at least dispersed the darkness surrounding the problem of free will and determinism." It was the golden age of philosophy, an age, however, which bore within itself the seeds of its own decay. Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, the members of the learned dynasty, defined metaphysics, or philosophy, as the ideal reconstruction of the universe from certain indisputable principles, the discovery of these principles being, for the most part, dependent on the possession of a special mental genius. Like Spinoza before them, they deduced from premises which they regarded as absolute, conclusions which seemed to them to be necessary. Closing their eyes to the facts, these thinkers trusted in their ability to account for those facts by showing what would be the unavoidable logical consequences of certain axiomatic first principles. Experience they considered as valueless in this connection. The most that it could do was to verify the deductions of philosophy. Schelling denies to it even this worth. The ideal construction, or hypothesis, of the thinker needs no such verification. It is self-sufficient, a law unto itself. If the facts do not square with the results of the speculation, so much the worse for the facts. Although Hegel does not wholly depreciate experimental knowledge, he too lays chief stress on a priori method. Knowledge is boundless in its possibilities. No limit can be set to man's faculty of truth. Basing themselves upon such conceptions as these, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel undertook the construction of an edifice, which, though grand and daring in plan and execution, had no foundation on the earth. And when philosophy loses its footing on the ground, it must, Aeneas-like, perish in midair. While the German metaphysicians and their following were proving by all the rules of logic what the world really ought to be, the exact sciences were modestly finding out what it actually was. The whistle of the locomotive suddenly awakened the speculator from his dreams and called his attention to the wonderful progress of natural science with its fruitful methods and useful results. A reaction soon set in against Hegelianism, and its star sank. Men grew weary of fanciful speculations and longed to return from the clouds to the realities of the material world. Railroads were built. Trade and commerce took enormous strides forward. Commercial and polytechnical schools were founded. All energies were directed towards the discovery, explanation, and application of material laws, and the exact sciences took the place in the public confidence once held by philosophy. Liebig, the great chemist, introduced the laboratory into German universities. Alexander von Humboldt made a reputation for himself as a scientist. Important discoveries were made in France and Germany by physiologists like Müller, Weber, Florenz, Magendie, Luricht, Longet. Philosophy lost her crown, despised and forsaken by a world that was now as extreme in its contempt as it had formerly been extravagant in its praise. There was none so poor to do her reverence. The philosopher was described as one speaking of things which he knew nothing, in words which no one could understand. The mistake lay in identifying all philosophy with the temporary, one-sided phase of it. The hue and cry was raised against the persecuted queen. The natural sciences, of course, renounced their allegiance and established an anti-philosophical republic of their own. They deluded themselves into believing in the possibility of excluding philosophical conceptions from their realm. They simply succeeded in introducing loose, illogical notions into their explanations. Notions that careful thinkers had long ago rejected as unsatisfactory. Materialism, the simplest and the most insufficient solution of the world problem, became the order of the day. Conditions like these could not fail to intimidate philosophy. Misfortune is apt to humble us. It is not strange, then, that the succeeding generation of philosophers should have been meek, and that even so late as 1874, Wundt should have felt the need of proving that philosophy had a right to exist and might justly claim a place among the sciences. This period of reaction, however, was as transitory as its cause had been. The disturbed pendulum was simply swinging to the other side before resuming its regular movements. The metaphysical need, or impulse, as Schopenhauer terms it, is too powerful in man to be permanently suppressed. To ask why is one of the noblest functions of the human being. To stifle such inquiry would be equivalent to destroying all intellectual activity. It cannot be stifled. Philosophy is not of an age, but for all time. The last philosopher will die when the last man dies, unless, indeed, that individual happen to be a hopeless idiot. Whoever is capable of thought at all will attempt in some way, be it ever so crude, to explain to himself the world and his place in the world. What does it all mean? What is it all for? Are the questions which force themselves upon every intelligent being, and are answered by him according to the light that is in him. Indeed, his queries themselves are pregnant with entire metaphysical systems. Nor can the exact sciences themselves operate without metaphysical conceptions. However violently they may protest against metaphysics as though it were the plague itself, they inevitably succumb to the disease, if disease it be. Is the theory of descent utterly free from the taint? Is the atomic theory, which Greek philosophy originated in the 4th century BC, any less the metaphysical because it promulgated by modern scientists? Is not the attempt to reduce all material facts to their ultimates, matter and force or energy, metaphysical? Is not the theory of the indestructibility of matter and the conservation of energy, as conceived by many, metaphysical? Is not the attempt to refer all energies to one ultimate energy a bold and grand attempt to reach a unity, a first principle on which all else depends? And what can be more metaphysical than that? In truth, the philosophical tendency to reduce plurality and diversity to unity, to find one common principle that may be able to explain all phenomena, prevails in every scientific procedure, because it constitutes the very essence of mental activity. We cannot resist the impulse to unify our experiences. We would reach a comprehensive survey of all existence, discover the principle or principles which will explain all facts. The different sciences dealing with different sets of facts may find ultimates capable of accounting for their facts respectively, but only by ignoring other facts. They give us, as it were, cross-sections of reality, while we wish to get a comprehensive view of the whole. Physics may be able to explain its facts by assuming the existence of homogeneous atoms and force. But can the chemist understand his phenomena without presupposing the qualitative difference of such atoms? Can the biologist undertake to interpret life with purely mechanical principles? Can he reconcile the purposiveness of organisms with the mechanical theory of causation? Will the psychologist, who deals with states of mind or consciousness, be able to account for the existence of these from the physicist's principles, atoms, and motion? A science is needed that will consciously and methodically aim to bring order into this chaos, that will consider all the facts and, if possible, unify these facts. It will subject the principles offered by the various sciences to the most critical examination, compare them with one another, point out their inconsistencies where such exist. It will, in short, rectify, harmonize, and, if possible, unify results. Such a science is philosophy. Its need is apparent. If men are bound to philosophize at all, it is a reasonable demand that they should do the work well. We cannot leave the solution of the greatest problems to chance, to haphazard methods of persons unskilled in such work, and prejudiced enough to adjust the facts to their theories. Here, as everywhere else, he will do the best work who has the best training and concentrates his entire time and energy upon the field of his choice. Such reflections as these have brought the modern world back again to philosophy. The Philistine is defined as the man without intellectual needs, and the Philistine alone sees no need of philosophy. The great scientists do not allow their occupation with the details of reality to blunt their vision of the whole. They look up from their microscopes occasionally. They cannot rest satisfied with blindly staring at the minutiae. They aim to understand things by seeing them in their relations to the whole. The measurement of time required for a current to pass through the sciatic nerve of a frog will not, taken by itself, make us any the wiser. Mere facts must be made the stepping stones to something higher. Our age is becoming more fully aware of the need of philosophical study. This is evident from the renewal of the philosophical activity in all departments of knowledge. Protestant theology is striving after a rational explanation of dogmas. Heresy trials show that. Catholicism has its philosophy. It accepts the conceptions of Thomas Aquinas, whose source is Aristotle. In jurisprudence, economics, politics, sociology, and history, the philosophical tendency is manifesting itself. Mathematicians, too, are speculating concerning the nature of number, space, and related notions. In the words of Wundt, The view is spreading among natural scientists that the mere description and combination of the facts of a limited field will no longer suffice, but that it is the highest aim of the particular branches of natural science to cooperate in obtaining a comprehensive conception of nature. A further evidence of the intensification of philosophical activity is offered by the increased sale of philosophical books, the publication of philosophical journals, and the strengthening and establishment of departments of philosophy in our universities. Our own country, though frequently accused of being the most materialistic nation on the globe, is becoming a zealous admirer of philosophy. Our philosophical journals are increasing in number and in circulation, and improving in scientific merit, while our great publishing houses are issuing the works of noted authors of all countries and rendering them accessible to a wider sphere of students. We have been discussing in the foregoing the fortunes and nature of philosophy proper during the immediate past. We identified the term philosophy with metaphysics, or the science of first principles. But the philosophical study does not occupy itself wholly with metaphysics. That, in truth, is the very highest and hence latest function. It cannot attempt to offer an explanation of the facts of the world until it has become acquainted with a large body of these facts. Now that the world as a whole presents us with two sets of phenomena, physical and mental, and corresponding to this division, we have two classes of sciences, physical or natural science and mental science. The former deals with the manifestation of the external or physical universe with lifeless and living matter. The latter with the manifestations of the inner world with consciousness or mind. The fundamental mental science is now called psychology, which analyzes, classifies, and explains states of consciousness. On it are based such studies as logic, aesthetics, ethics, and the philosophy of religion. Psychology asks such questions as these. What are the nature and conditions of sensation, perception, imagination, memory, conception, emotion, instinct, impulse, attention, volition? All of these states bring facts of mind or consciousness. Logic asks, how does the mind act when it reasons, when it reaches sentences that we regard as true? What are the forms or laws or principles of reasoning? What are the methods employed by the scientist in his investigations? What, in short, are the rules of deduction and induction? Aesthetics asks, what in the soul and in objects is it that makes us call things beautiful or ugly, sublime or ridiculous? What makes a production a work of art? What are the laws or principles governing the artistic? Ethics asks, what are the characteristics of morality? Why do we designate one act as right, another as wrong? What forms the criterion or standard which moral facts are measured? We feel that certain courses of conduct are wrong. What is the nature and the origin of this feeling? How is it developed? What, in short, are the laws or principles governing the moral world? And how do these principles find expression in the life of man? Closely related to psychology and ethics, and furnishing them with a large body of facts, are the social sciences, which consider the thoughts, feelings and volitions of social organisms, or man in society, the ends which such organisms serve, and the means which with such ends are reached. Society, unconsciously or consciously, aims to realize certain ends. What are these ends? How are they realized? We must study the forms which realizes them. We must study human customs and institutions and trace their development. Sociology is the name given to the science which performs this task. These ends cannot be realized without organization or the state. What are the forms of government, and how do governments realize their ends? The theory of the state, or science of politics, discusses these questions. It bears the same relation to sociology that ethics bears to psychology. The philosophy of religion investigates those inner facts of human experience, which we call religious facts, and is, insofar as it does this, a branch of psychology. But it also studies their external expression, the different forms, and traces the development of positive religions in order to discover from the material thus presented the principles common to all religions. What is the idea which seems to be realizing itself in the history of religion? The philosopher must pay attention to the fundamental mental sciences, psychology, logic, ethics, aesthetics, and the philosophy of religion. These sciences differ from the so-called natural sciences only in their content or subject matter, not in their general form or methods. All sciences, both physical and mental, occupy themselves with observing phenomena and reducing them to laws, employing all available means of accomplishing this task. But no science restricts itself to a mere registration of laws. It seeks to discover the relations between these laws, to connect them, and to reduce them to their simplest forms. The physicist refers all material manifestations to one underlying principle or force. The biologist finds it impossible to explain his facts by means of purely mechanical principles. How can we reconcile the purposiveness of organisms with the principle of causation? The psychologist, again, is brought into contact with another group of facts which the atomic theory cannot account for. Mind cannot be explained on a purely materialistic basis. The scientist may be able, by means of mechanical laws, to show how a planetary system was evolved from chaos. But can he account for the existence of the amoeba? Can his principles account for the simplest fact of consciousness? To quote Kant's celebrated words, "It seems to me," he declares in his theory of the heavens, "that in a certain sense a man may say without presumption, 'Give me matter, and I will build you a world.' But can he make the same boast with reference to the simplest plant or insect? Can he say, 'Give me matter, and I will explain to you the evolution of a caterpillar'?" Each science endeavors to reduce the most diverse facts with which it deals to identify to one underlying principle. Heat, light, sound, electricity are different forms of some underlying force or energy. Are states of consciousness referable to the same force? Or must we assume another ultimate, of which both physical and mental facts are the expression, as the monists hold? All these are problems that are worth considering. the difficulty of solving them and the disagreement existing between the attempts to solve them suggest another problem. The human mind has a tendency to unify, to reduce facts to ultimates, to first principles. What is the value of this tendency as a means of reaching truth? Can we know anything about these tillings? The instrument of knowledge, the human mind, without which there could be no science at all, is itself a fact which needs to be explained. We evidently employ the same methods in the different branches of knowledge. We explain facts by referring to them by their antecedents, simply because this is the function of the mind. But is there no limit to this search for the antecedents or causes? What epistemological value has the casual instinct? In fact, what does human knowledge consist in, and how is it possible, as Kant asks? Define its limits before you set out on the vast sea of speculation. We need a science which will examine the nature and validity of knowledge, a theory of knowledge. As Helmholtz declares, no age can with impunity refuse the task of examining the sources of our knowledge and the ground of its validity. The different sciences employ the categories of thinking without investigating their validity. Philosophy must regard with suspicion everything that is not clear as day. It is nothing if not critical. In his attempt to explain the sensible world, the scientist often has recourse to the suprasensuous. Can we know anything of the suprasensuous, or must we confine our efforts to the study of what our senses present to us? Must we accept Du Bois-Reymond's verdict? Concerning the riddles as to what matter and force are, and whether they can think, the natural scientist must once for all decide upon the verdict, ignorabimus. Or shall we protest with Haeckel against the position that there can be invincible barriers to nature erkennen? There are many other problems which suggest themselves to epistemology, or theory of knowledge. Such a science not only forms the prelude to the most important part of philosophy, to metaphysics, but also assists the thinker in discovering the inconsistent and premature metaphysical conceptions which stealthily creep into all branches of knowledge. The natural scientist frequently rails against metaphysics in the very words of metaphysics, without knowing that his entire mental activity is based on metaphysical preconditions. Metaphysics is the old man of the sea, whom the scientific Sindbad carries on his own shoulders, without, however, feeling the load. After having studied the limits and validity of human knowledge, the philosopher is ready for the construction of his metaphysical system. He calls to his aid the history of philosophy, which unrolls before him the thoughts of past ages and bids him profit by their experience. The history of philosophy must not be regarded as a disconnected succession of arbitrary individual opinions and clever guesses. It is not a formless aggregate of errors, not a series of unsuccessful attempts to reach truth. It is not a Sisyphean labor, a Penelopean woof. The history of philosophy is a development, an evolution, in which the forms which follow generally show an advance over what precedes. And even if it were a mere catalogue of errors, it would be of service to the metaphysician by pointing out to him the lines of thought that have ended in blind alleys. It would warn him against wasting his energies in fields that have been worked over. The man who knows how a solution cannot be effected is on the road to knowledge. The place of science in a liberal education. Bertrand Russell. 1. Science, to the ordinary reader of newspapers, is represented by a varying selection of sensational triumphs, such as wireless telegraphy and aeroplanes, radioactivity, and the marvels of modern alchemy. It is not of this aspect of science that I wish to speak. Science, in this aspect, consists of detached, up-to-date fragments, interesting only until they are replaced by something newer and more up-to-date, displaying nothing of the systems of patiently constructed knowledge out of which, almost as a casual incident, have come the practically useful results which interest the man in the street. The increased command over the forces of nature, which is derived from science, is undoubtedly an amply sufficient reason for encouraging scientific research. But this reason has been so often urged and is so easily appreciated that other reasons, to my mind quite as important, are apt to be overlooked. It is with these other reasons, especially with the intrinsic value of a scientific habit of mind in forming our outlook on the world, that I shall be concerned in what follows. The instance of wireless telegraphy will serve to illustrate the difference between the 2 points of view. Almost all the serious intellectual labor required for the possibility of this invention is due to 3 men. Faraday, Maxwell, and Hertz. In alternating layers of experiment and theory, these 3 men built up the modern theory of electromagnetism and demonstrated the identity of light with electromagnetic waves. The system which they discovered is one of profound intellectual interest, bringing together and unifying an endless variety of apparently detached phenomena and displaying a cumulative mental power which cannot but afford delight to every generous spirit. The mechanical details which remained to be adjusted in order to utilize their discoveries for a practical system of telegraphy demanded, no doubt, very considerable ingenuity, but had not that broad sweep and that universality which could give them intrinsic interest as an object of disinterested contemplation. From the point of view of training the mind, of giving that well-informed, impersonal outlook which constitutes culture in the good sense of this much misused word, it seems to be generally held indisputable that a literary education is superior to one based on science. Even the warmest advocates of science are apt to rest their claims on the contention that culture ought to be sacrificed to utility. Those men of science who respect culture, when they associate with men learned in the classics, are apt to admit, not merely politely, but sincerely, a certain inferiority on their side, compensated doubtless by the services which science renders to humanity, but nonetheless real. And so long this attitude exists among men of science, it tends to verify itself. The intrinsically valuable aspects of science tend to be sacrificed to the merely useful, and little attempt is made to preserve that leisurely, systematic survey by which the finer quality of mind is formed and nourished. But even if there be, in present fact, any such inferiority as is supposed in the educational value of science, this is, I believe, not the fault of science itself, but the fault of the spirit in which science is taught. If its full possibilities were realized by those who teach it, I believe that its capacity of producing those habits of mind which constitute the highest mental excellence would be at least as great as that of literature, and more particularly of Greek and Latin literature. In saying this, I have no wish whatever to disparage a classical education. I have not myself enjoyed its benefits, and my knowledge of Greek and Latin authors is derived almost wholly from translations. But I am firmly persuaded that the Greeks fully deserve all the admiration that is bestowed upon them, and that it is a very great and serious loss to be unacquainted with their writings. It is not by attacking them, but by drawing attention to neglected excellences in science that I wish to conduct my argument. One defect, however, does seem to inherit in a purely classical education, namely, a too exclusive emphasis on the past. By the study of what is absolutely ended and can never be renewed, a habit of criticism towards the present and the future is engendered. The qualities in which the present excels are qualities to which the study of the past does not direct attention, and to which, therefore, the student of Greek civilization may easily become blind. In what is new and growing there is apt to be something crude, insolent, and even a little vulgar, which is shocking to the man of sensitive taste. Quivering from the rough contact, he retires to the trim gardens of a polished past, forgetting that they were reclaimed from the wilderness by men as rough and earth-soiled as those from whom he shrinks in his own day. The habit of being unable to recognize merit until it is dead is too apt to be the result of a purely bookish life, and a culture based wholly on the past will seldom be able to pierce through everyday surroundings to the essential splendor of contemporary things, or to the hope of still greater splendor in the future. My eyes saw not the men of old, and now their age away has rolled. I weep to think I shall not see the heroes of posterity. So says the Chinese poet. But such impartiality is rare in the more pugnacious atmosphere of the West, where the champions of the past and future fight a never-ending battle, instead of combining to seek out the merits of both. This consideration, which militates not only against the exclusive study of the classics, but against every form of culture which has become static, traditional, and academic, leads inevitably to the fundamental question: what is the true end of education? But before attempting to answer this question, it will be well to define the sense in which we are to use the word education. For this purpose, I shall distinguish the sense in which I mean to use it from the two others, both perfectly legitimate, the one broader, and the other narrower than the sense in which I mean to use the word. In the broader sense, education will include not only what we learn through instruction, but all that we learn through personal experience, the formation of character through the education of life. Of this aspect of education, vitally important as it is, I will say nothing, since its consideration would introduce topics quite foreign to the question with which we are concerned. In the narrower sense, education may be confined to instruction, the imparting of definite information on various subjects, because such information, in and for itself, is useful in daily life. Elementary education, reading, writing, and arithmetic, is almost wholly of this kind. But instruction, necessary as it is, does not per se constitute education in the sense in which I wish to consider it. Education, in the sense in which I mean it, may be defined as the formation, by means of instruction, of certain mental habits and a certain outlook on life and the world. It remains to ask ourselves, what mental habits and what sort of outlook can be hoped for as the result of instruction? When we have answered this question, we can attempt to decide what science has to contribute to the formation of the habits and outlook which we desire. Our whole life is built about a certain number, not a very small number, of primary instincts and impulses. Only what is in some way connected with these instincts and impulses appears to us desirable or important. There is no faculty, whether reason or virtue, or whatever it may be called, that can take our active life and our hopes and fears outside the region controlled by these first movers of all desire. Each of them is like a queen bee, aided by a hive of workers gathering honey. But when the queen is gone, the workers languish and die, and the cells remain empty of their expected sweetness. So, with each primary impulse in civilized man, it is surrounded and protected by a busy swarm of attendant derivative desires, which store up in its service whatever honey the surrounding world affords. But if the queen impulse dies, the death-dealing influence, though retarded a little by habit, spreads slowly through all the subsidiary impulses, and a whole tract of life becomes inexplicably colorless. What was formerly full of zest and so obviously worth doing that it raised no questions, has now grown dreary and purposeless. With a sense of disillusion, we inquire the meaning of life, and decide, perhaps, that all is vanity. The search for an outside meaning that can compel an inner response must always be disappointed. All meaning must be at bottom related to our primary desires, and when they are extinct, no miracle can restore to the world the value which they reflected upon it. The purpose of education, therefore, cannot be to create any primary impulse which is lacking in the uneducated. The purpose can only to be enlarge the scope of those that human nature provides by increasing the number and variety of attendant thoughts, and by showing where the most permanent satisfaction is to be found. Under the impulse of a Calvinistic horror of the natural man, this obvious truth has been too often misconceived in the training of the young. Nature has been falsely regarded as excluding all that is best in what is natural, and the endeavor to teach virtue has led to the production of stunted and contorted hypocrites instead of full-grown human beings. From such mistakes in education, a better psychology or a kinder heart is beginning to preserve the current generation. We need, therefore, waste no more words on the theory that the purpose of education is to thwart or eradicate nature. But although nature must supply the initial force of desire, nature is not, in the civilized man, the spasmodic, fragmentary, and yet violent set of impulses that it is in the savage. Each impulse has its constitutional ministry of thought and knowledge and reflection, through which possible conflicts of impulses are foreseen, and temporary impulses are controlled by the unifying impulse, which may be called wisdom. In this way, education destroys the crudity of instinct and increases through knowledge the wealth and variety of the individual's contacts with the outside world, making him no longer an isolated fighting unit, but a citizen of the universe, embracing distant countries, remote regions of space, and vast stretches of past and future within the circle of his interests. It is this simultaneous softening in the insistence of desire and enlargement of its scope that is the chief moral end of education. Closely connected with this moral end is the more purely intellectual aim of education, the endeavor to make us see and imagine the world in an objective manner, as far as possible as it is in itself, and not merely through the distorting medium of personal desire. The complete attainment of such an objective view is no doubt an ideal, indefinitely approachable, but not actually and fully realizable. Education, considered as a process of forming our mental habits and our outlook on the world, is to be judged successful in proportion as its outcome approximates to this ideal. In proportion, that is to say, as it gives us a true view of our place in society, of the relation of the whole human society to its non-human environment, and of the nature of the non-human world as it is in itself, apart from our desires and interests. If this standard is admitted, we can return to the consideration of science, inquiring how far science contributes to such an aim, and whether it is in any respect superior to its rivals in educational practice. 2. Two opposite and at first sight conflicting merits belong to science as against literature and art. The one, which is not inherently necessary, but is certainly true, at the present day, is hopefulness as to the future of human achievement, and in particular as to the useful work that may be accomplished by any intelligent student. This merit and the cheerful outlook which it engenders prevents what might otherwise be the depressing effect of another aspect of science, to my mind also a merit, and perhaps its greatest merit. I mean the irrelevance of human passions and of the whole subjective apparatus where scientific truth is concerned. Each of these reasons for preferring the study of science requires some amplification. Let us begin with the first. In the study of literature or art, our attention is perpetually riveted upon the past. The men of Greece or of the Renaissance did better than any men do now. The triumphs of former ages, so far from facilitating fresh triumphs in our own age, actually increases the difficulty of fresh triumphs by rendering originality harder of attainment. Not only is artistic achievement not cumulative, but it seems even to depend upon a certain freshness and naivete of impulse and vision which civilization tends to destroy. Hence comes, to those who have been nourished on the literary and artistic production of former ages, a certain peevishness and undue fastidiousness towards the present, from which there seems no escape except into the deliberate vandalism which ignores tradition and, in the search after originality, achieves only the eccentric. But in the vandalism, there is none of the simplicity and spontaneity out of which great art springs. Theory is still the canker in its core, and insincerity destroys the advantages of a merely pretended ignorance. The despair thus arising from an education which suggests no preeminent mental activity, except that of an artistic creation, is wholly absent from an education which gives the knowledge of scientific method. The discovery of scientific method, except in pure mathematics, is a thing of yesterday. Speaking broadly, we may say that it dates from Galileo. Yet already it has transformed the world, and its success proceeds with ever-accelerating velocity. In science, men have discovered an activity of the very highest value in which they are no longer, as an art, dependent for progress upon the appearance of continually greater genius. For in the science, the successors stand upon the shoulders of their predecessors. Where one man of supreme genius has invented a method, 1,000 lesser men can apply it. No transcendent ability is required in order to make useful discoveries in science. The edifice of science needs its masons, bricklayers, and common laborers, as well as its foremen, master builders, and architects. In art, nothing worth doing can be done without genius. In science, even a very moderate capacity can contribute to a supreme achievement. In science, the man of real genius is the man who invents a new method. The notable discoveries are often made by his successors, who can apply the method with fresh vigor, unimpaired by the previous labor of perfecting it. But the mental caliber of the thoughts required for the work, however brilliant, is not so great as that required by the first inventor of the method. There are in science immense numbers of different methods, appropriate to different classes of problems. But over and above them all, there is something not easily definable, which may be called the method of science. It was formerly customary to identify this with the inductive method and to associate it with the name of Bacon. But the true inductive method was not discovered by Bacon, and the true method of science is something which includes deduction as much as induction, logic, and mathematics as much as botany and geology. I shall not attempt the difficult task of stating what the scientific method is, but I will try to indicate the temper of mind out of which the scientific method grows, which is the second of the two merits that were mentioned above as belonging to a scientific education. The kernel of the scientific outlook is a thing so simple, so obvious, so seemingly trivial, that the mention of it may almost excite derision. The kernel of the scientific outlook is the refusal to regard our own desires, tastes, and interests as affording a key to the understanding of the world. Stated thus baldly, this may seem no more than a trite truism, but to remember it consistently in matters arousing our passionate partisanship is by no means easy, especially where the available evidence is uncertain and inconclusive. A few illustrations will make this clear. Aristotle, I understand, considered that the stars must move in circles because the circle is the most perfect curve. In the absence of evidence to the contrary, he allowed himself to decide a question of fact by an appeal to aesthetico-moral considerations. In such a case, it is at once obvious to us that this appeal was unjustifiable. We now know how to ascertain as a fact the way in which the heavenly bodies move, and we know that they do not move in circles, or even in accurate ellipses, or in any other kind of simply describable curve. This may be painful to a certain hankering after simplicity of pattern in the universe, but we know that in astronomy such feelings are irrelevant. Easy as this knowledge seems now, we owe it to the courage and insight of the first inventors of scientific method, and more especially of Galileo. We may take as another illustration Malthus's doctrine of population. This illustration is all the better for the fact that his actual doctrine is now known to be largely erroneous. It is not his conclusions that are valuable, but the temper and method of his inquiry. As everyone knows, it was to him that Darwin owed an essential part of his theory of natural selection, and this was only possible because Malthus's outlook was truly scientific. His great merit lies in considering man not as the object of praise or blame, but as part of nature, a thing with a certain characteristic behavior, from which certain consequences must follow. If the behavior is not quite what Malthus supposed, if the consequences are not quite what he inferred, that may falsify his conclusions, but that does not impair the value of his method. The objections which were made when his doctrine was new, that it was horrible and depressing, that people ought not to act as he said they did, and so on, were all such as implied an unscientific attitude of mind. As against all of them, his calm determination to treat man as a natural phenomenon marks an important advance over the reformers of the 18th century and the Revolution. Under the influence of Darwinism, the scientific attitude towards man has now become fairly common, and is to some people quite natural, though to most it is still a difficult and artificial intellectual contortion. There is, however, one study which is as yet almost wholly untouched by the scientific spirit. I mean the study of philosophy. Philosophers and the public image that the scientific spirit must pervade pages that bristle with allusions to ions, germ plasms, and the eyes of shellfish. But as the devil can quote scripture, so the philosopher can quote science. The scientific spirit is not an affair of quotation, of externally acquired information, any more than manners are an affair of the etiquette book. The scientific attitude of mind involves a sweeping away of all other desires in the interests of the desire to know. It involves suppression of hopes and fears, loves and hates, and the whole subjective emotional life, until we become subdued to the material, able to see it frankly, without preconceptions, without bias, without any wish except to see it as it is, and without any belief that what it is must be determined by some relation, positive or negative, to what we should like it to be, or what we can easily imagine it to be. Now in philosophy, this attitude of mind has not as yet been achieved. A certain self-absorption, not personal, but human, has marked almost all attempts to conceive the universe as a whole. Mind, or some aspect of it, thought, or will, or sentience, has been regarded as the pattern after which the universe is to be conceived, for no better reason, at bottom, than that such a universe would not seem strange, and would give us the cozy feeling that every place is like home. To conceive the universe as essentially progressive or essentially deteriorating, for example, is to give our hopes and fears a cosmic importance which may, of course, be justified, but which we has of yet no reason to suppose justified. Until we have learnt to think of it in ethically neutral terms, we have not arrived at a scientific attitude in philosophy, and until we have arrived at such an attitude, it is hardly to be hoped that philosophy will achieve any solid results. I have spoken so far largely of the negative aspects of the scientific spirit, but it is from the positive aspect that its value is derived. The instinct of constructiveness, which is one of the chief incentives to artistic creation, can find in scientific systems a satisfaction more massive than any epic poem. Disinterested curiosity, which is the source of almost all intellectual effort, finds with astonished delight that science can unveil secrets which might have well seemed forever undiscoverable. The desire for a larger life and wider interests, for an escape from private circumstances, and even from the whole recurring human cycle of birth and death, is fulfilled by the impersonal cosmic outlook of science as by nothing else. To all these must be added, as contributing to the happiness of the man of science, the admiration of splendid achievement, and the consciousness of inestimable utility to the human race. A life devoted to science is therefore a happy life, and its happiness is derived from the very best sources that are open to dwellers on this troubled and passionate planet. The Types of Philosophic Thinking. William James. As these lectures are meant to be public, and so few, I have assumed all very special problems to be excluded, and some topic of general interest required. Fortunately, our age seems to be growing philosophical again. Still in the ashes live the wonted fires. Oxford, long the seed bed for the English world, of the idealism inspired by Kant and Hegel, has recently become the nursery of a very different way of thinking. Even non-philosophers have begun to take an interest in a controversy over what is known as pluralism or humanism. It looks a little as if the ancient English empirism, so long put out of fashion here by nobler-sounding Germanic formulas, might be repluming itself and getting ready for a stronger flight than ever. It looks as if foundations were being sounded and examined afresh. Individuality outruns all classification, yet we insist on classifying every one we meet under some general head, as these heads usually suggest prejudicial associations to some hearer or other. The life of philosophy largely consists of resentments at the classing and complaints of being misunderstood. But there are signs of clearing up and, on the whole, less acrimony in discussion, for which both Oxford and Harvard are partly to be thanked. As I look back into the 60s, Mill, Bain, and Hamilton were the only official philosophers in Britain. Spencer, Martineau, and Hodgson were just the beginning. In France, the pupils of Cousin were delving into history only, and Renovier alone had an original system. In Germany, the Hegelian impetus had spent itself, and, apart from historical scholarship, nothing but the materialistic controversy remained, with such men as Buchner and Urici as its champions. Lotz and Fechner were the sole original thinkers, and Fechner was not a professional philosopher at all. The general impression made was of crude issues and oppositions, of a small subtlety, and of a widely spread ignorance. Amateurishness was rampant. Samuel Bailey's Letters on the Philosophy of the Human Mind, published in 1855, are one of the ablest expressions of English associationism, and a book of real power. Yet hear how he writes of Kant. No one, after reading the extracts, etc., can be surprised to hear of a declaration by men of eminent abilities that, after years of study, they had not succeeded in gathering one clear idea from the speculations of Kant. I should have been almost surprised if they had. In or about 1818, Lord Grenville, when visiting the lakes of England, observed to Professor Wilson that, after 5 years' study of Kant's philosophy, he had not gathered from it one clear idea. Wilberforce, about the same time, made the same confession to another friend of my own. "I am endeavoring," exclaimed Sir James Mackintosh, in the irritation, evidently, of baffled efforts, "to understand this accursed German philosophy." What Oxford thinker would dare to print such knife and provincial-sounding citations of authority today? The torch of learning passes from land to land as the spirit bloweth the flame. The deepening of philosophic consciousness came to us English folk from Germany, as it will probably pass back ere long. Ferrier, J. H. Sterling, and, most of all, T. H. Green are to be thanked. If asked to tell in broad strokes what the main doctrinal change has been, I should call it a change from the crudity of the older English thinking, its ultra-simplicity of mind, both when it was religious and when it was anti-religious, toward a rationalism derived in the first instance from Germany, but relived from German technicality and shrillness, and content to suggest and to remain vague, and to be, in the English fashion, devout. By the time T. H. Green began at Oxford, the generation seemed to feel as if it had fed on the chopped straw of psychology and of its associationism long enough, and as if a little vastness, even though it went with vagueness, as if some moist wind from far away, reminding us of our prenatal sublimity, would be welcome. Green's great point of attack was the disconnectedness of the reigning English sensationalism. Relating was the great intellectual activity for him, and the key to this relating was believed by him to lodge itself at last in what most of you know as Kant's unity of apperception, transformed into a living spirit of the world. Hence a monism of a devout kind. In some way, we must be fallen angels, one with intelligence as such, and a great disdain for empiricism of the sensationalist sort has always characterized this school of thought, which, on the whole, has reigned supreme at Oxford and in the Scottish universities until the present day. But now there are signs of its giving way to a wave of revised empiricism. I confess that I should be glad to see this latest wave prevail. So, the sooner I am frank about it, the better. I hope to have my voice counted in its favor as one of the results of this lecture course. What do the terms empiricism and rationalism mean? Reduced to their most pregnant difference, empiricism means the habit of explaining wholes by parts, and rationalism means the habit of explaining parts by wholes. Rationalism thus preserves affinities with monism, since the wholeness goes with union, while empiricism inclines to pluralistic views. No philosophy can ever be anything but a summary sketch, a picture of the world in abridgment, a foreshortened bird's-eye view of the perspective of events. And the first thing to notice is this, that the only material we have at our disposal for making a picture of the whole world is supplied by the various portions of that world of which we have already had experience. We can invent no new forms of conception, applicable to the whole exclusively, and not suggested originally by the parts. All philosophers, accordingly, have conceived of the whole world after the analogy of some particular feature of it which has particularly captivated their attention. Thus the theists take their cue from manufacture, the pantheists from growth. For one man, the world is like a thought or a grammatical sentence in which a thought is expressed. For such a philosopher, the whole must logically be prior to the parts. For letters would never have been invented without syllables to spell, or syllables without words to utter. Another man, struck by the disconnectedness and mutual accidentality of so many of the world's details, takes the universe as a whole to have been such a disconnectedness originally, and supposes order to have been superinduced upon it in the second instance, possibly by attrition and the gradual wearing away by internal friction of portions that originally interfered. Another will conceive the order as only a statistical appearance, and the universe will be for him like a vast grab bag with black and white balls in it, of which we guess the quantities only probably by the frequency with which we experience their egress. For another, again, there is no really inherent order. But it is we who project order into the world by selecting objects and tracing relations so as to gratify our intellectual interests. We carve out order by leaving the disorderly parts out, and the world is conceived thus after the analogy of a forest or a block of marble from which parks or statues may be produced by eliminating irrelevant trees or chips of stone. Some thinkers follow suggestions from human life and treat the universe as if it were essentially a place in which ideals are realized. Others are more struck by its lower features, and for them, brute necessities express its character better. All follow one analogy or another, and all the analogies are with some one or other of the universe's subdivisions. Every one is nevertheless prone to claim that his conclusions are the only logical ones, that they are necessities of universal reason, they being all the while, at bottom, accidents, more or less, of personal vision, which had far better be avowed as such. For one man's vision may be much more valuable than another's, and our visions are usually not only our most interesting, but our most respectable contributions to the world in which we play our part. What was reason given to men for, said some 18th century writer, except to enable them to find reasons for what they want to think and do? And I think the history of philosophy largely bears him out. The aim of knowledge, says Hegel, is to divest the objective world of its strangeness and to make us more at home in it. Different men find their minds more at home in very different fragments of the world. Let me make a few comments here on the curious antipathies which these partialities arouse. They are sovereignly unjust, for all the parties are human beings with the same essential interests, and no one of them is the wholly perverse demon which another often imagines him to be. Both are loyal to the world that bears them. Neither wishes to spoil it. Neither wishes to regard it as an insane incoherence. Both want to keep it as a universe of some kind, and their differences are all secondary to this deep agreement. They may be only propensities to empathize differently, or one man may care for finality and security more than the other, or their tastes in language may be different. One may like a universe that lends itself to lofty and exalted characterization. To another, this may seem sentimental or rhetorical. One may wish for the right to use a clerical vocabulary, another a technical or professorial one. A certain old farmer of my acquaintance in America was called a rascal by one of his neighbors. He immediately smote the man, saying, "I won't stand none of your diminutive epithets." Empiricist minds, putting parts before the whole, appear to rationalists who start from the whole, and consequently enjoy magniloquent privileges to use epithets offensively diminutive. But all such differences are minor matters which ought to be subordinated in view of the fact that, whether we can be empiricists or rationalists, we are, ourselves, part of the universe, and share the same one deep concern in its destinies. We crave alike to feel more truly at home with it and to contribute our might to its amelioration. It would be pitiful if small aesthetic discords were to keep honest men asunder. I shall myself have use for the diminutive epithets of empiricism, but if you look behind the words at the spirit, I am sure you will not find it matricidal. I am as good a son as any rationalist among you to our common mother. What troubles me more than this misapprehension is the genuine abstruseness of many of the matters I shall be obliged to talk about, and the difficulty of making them intelligible at one hearing. But their two pieces, zwei Stück, as Kant would have said, in every philosophy, the final outlook, belief, or attitude to which it brings us, and the reasonings by which that attitude is reached and mediated. A philosophy, as James Ferrier used to tell us, must indeed be true, but that is the least of its requirements. One may be true without being a philosopher, true by guesswork or by revelation. What distinguishes a philosopher's truth is that it is reasoned. Argument, not supposition, must have put it in his possession. Common men find themselves inheriting their beliefs. They know not how. They jump into them with both feet and stand there. Philosophers must do more. They must first get reason's license for them. And to the professional's philosophic mind, the operation of procuring a license is usually a thing of much more pith and moment than any particular beliefs to which the license may give the rights of access. Suppose, for example, that a philosopher's beliefs in what is called free will, that a common man alongside of him should also share that belief. Possessing it by a sort of inborn intuition does not endear the man to the philosopher at all. He may even be ashamed to be associated with such a man. What interests the philosopher is the particular premises on which the free will he believes in is established, the sense in which it is taken, the objections it eludes, the difficulties it takes in account of. In short, the whole form and temper and manner and technical apparatus that goes with the belief in question. A philosopher across the way who should use the same technical apparatus, making the same distinctions, etc., but drawing opposite conclusions and denying free will entirely, would fascinate the first philosopher far more than would the knife co-believer. Their common technical interests would unite them more than their opposite conclusions separate them. Each would feel an essential consanguinity in the other, would think of him, write at him, care for his good opinion. The simple-minded believer in free will would be disregarded by either. Neither as ally nor as opponent would his vote be counted. In a measure, this is doubtless as it should be, but like all professionalism, it can go to abusive extremes. The end is, after all, more than the way, in most things human, and forms and methods may easily frustrate their own purpose. The abuse of technicality is seen in the infrequency with which, in philosophical literature, metaphysical questions are discussed directly and on their own merits. Almost always they are handled as if through a heavy woolen curtain, the veil of previous philosophers' opinions. Alternatives are wrapped in proper names, as if it were indecent for a truth to go naked. The late Professor John Grote of Cambridge has some good remarks about this. Thought, he says, is not a professional matter, not something for so-called philosophers only, or for professed thinkers. The best philosopher is the man who can think most simply. I wish that people would consider that thought, and philosophy is no more than good and methodical thought, is a matter intimate to them, a portion of their real selves, that they would value what they think and be interested in it. In my own opinion, he goes on, there is something depressing in this weight of learning, with nothing that can come into one's mind, but one is told, "Oh, that is the opinion of such and such a person long ago." I can conceive of nothing more noxious for students than to get into the habit of saying to themselves about their ordinary philosophic thought, "Oh, somebody must have thought it all before." Yet this is the habit most encouraged at our seats of learning. You must tie your opinion to Aristotle's or Spinoza's. You must define it by its distance from Kant's. You must refute your rival's view by identifying it with Protagoras. Thus does all spontaneity of thought, all freshness of conception, get destroyed. Everything you touch is shop-worn. The over-technicality and consequent dreariness of its younger disciples at our American universities is appalling. It comes from too much following of German models and manners. Let me fervently express the hope that in this country you will hark back to the more humane English tradition. American students have to regain direct relations with our subject by painful individual effort in later life. Some of the younger ones, I fear, never will. So strong are the professional shop habits already. In a subject like philosophy, it is really fatal to lose connection with the open air of human nature and to think in terms of shop tradition only. In Germany, the forms are so professionalized that anybody who has gained a teaching chair and written a book, however distorted and eccentric, has the legal right to figure forever in the history of the subject like a fly in amber. All later comers have the duty of quoting him and measuring their opinions with his opinion. Such are the rules of professorial game. They think and write from each other and for each other and at each other exclusively. With this exclusion of the open air, all true perspective gets lost. Extremes and oddities count as much as sanities and command the same attention. And if by chance anyone writes popularly and about results only, with his mind directly focused on the subject, it is reckoned überflächiges Zeug and ganz unwissenschaftlich, which translates to superficial and completely unscientific. Professor Paulson has recently written some feeling lines about this over-professionalism, from the reign of which in Germany his own writings, which sin by being literary, have suffered loss of credit. Philosophy, he says, has long assumed in Germany the character of being an esoteric and occult science. There is a genuine fear of popularity. Simplicity of statement is deemed synonymous with hollowness and shallowness. He recalls an old professor saying to him once, "Yes, we philosophers, whenever we wish, can go so far that in a couple of sentences we can put ourselves where nobody can follow us." The professor said this with conscious pride, but he ought to have been ashamed of it. Great as technique is, results are greater. To teach philosophy so that the pupils' interest in technique exceeds that in results is surely a vicious aberration. It is bad form, not good form, in a discipline of such universal human interest. Moreover, technique for technique. Doesn't David Hume's technique set, after all, the kind of pattern most difficult to follow? Isn't it the most admirable? The English mind, thank heaven, and the French mind are still kept by their aversion to crude technique and barbarism closer to the truth's natural probabilities. Their literatures show fewer obvious falsities and monstrosities than that of Germany. Think of the German literature of aesthetics, with the preposterousness of such an unaesthetic personage as Immanuel Kant enthroned in its center. Think of German books on religious philosophy, with the heart's battles translated into conceptual jargon and made dialectic. The most persistent setter of questions, feeler of objections, insister on satisfactions, is the religious life. Yet all its troubles can be treated with absurdly little technicality. The wonder is that, with their way of working philosophy, individual Germans should preserve any spontaneity of mind at all. That they still manifest freshness and originality in so eminent a degree proves the indestructible richness of the German cerebral endowment. Let me repeat once more that a man's vision is the great fact about him. Who cares for Carlyle's reasons, or Schopenhauer's, or Spencer's? A philosophy is the expression of a man's intimate character, and all definitions of the universe are but the deliberately adopted reactions of human characters upon it. In the recent book from which I quoted the words of Professor Paulsen, a book of successive chapters by various living German philosophers, we pass from one idiosyncratic personal atmosphere into another, almost as if we were turning over a photograph album. If we take the whole history of philosophy, the systems reduce themselves to a few main types which, under all the technical verbiage in which the ingenious intellect of man envelops them, are just so many visions, modes of feeling the whole push and seeing the whole drift to life, forced on one by one's total character and experience, and on the whole preferred. There is no other truthful word, as the one's best working attitude. Cynical characters take one general attitude, sympathetic characters another. But no general attitude is possible towards the world as a whole until the intellect has developed considerable generalizing power and learned to take pleasure in synthetic formulas. The thought of very primitive men has hardly any tincture of philosophy. Nature can have little unity for savages. It is a Walpurgis nacked procession, a checkered play of light and shadow, a medley of impish and elfish friendly and inimicable powers. Close to nature, though they live, they are anything but Wordsworthians. If a bit of cosmic emotion ever thrills them, it is likely to be at midnight, when the camp smoke rises straight to the wicked full moon in the zenith, and in the forest is all the whispering with witchery and danger. The eeriness of the world, the mischief and the manyness, the littleness of the forces, the magical surprises, the unaccountability of every agent. These surely are the characters most impressive at that stage of culture. These communicate the thrills of curiosity and the earliest intellectual stirrings. Tempests and conflagrations, pestilences and earthquakes reveal supramundane powers and instigate religious terror rather than philosophy. Nature, more demonic than divine, is above all things multifarious. So many creatures that feed or threaten, that help or crush. So many beings to hate or love, to understand, or start at, which is on top and which subordinate. Who can tell? They are coordinate, rather, and to adapt ourselves to them singly, to square the dangerous powers and keep the others friendly, regardless of consistency or unity, is the chief problem. The symbol of nature at this stage, as Paulson well says, is the Sphinx, under whose nourishing breasts the tearing claws are visible. But in due course of time, the intellectual awoke, with its passion for generalizing, simplifying, and subordinating, and then began those divergences of conception which all later experience seems rather to have deepened than to have effaced, because objective nature has contributed to both sides impartially, and has let the thinkers empathize different parts of her and pile up opposite imaginary supplements. Perhaps the most interesting opposition is that which results from the clash between what I lately called the sympathetic and the cynical temper. Materialistic and spiritualistic philosophies are the rival types that result, the former defining the world so as to leave man's soul upon it as a soil of outside passenger or alien, while the latter insists that the intimate and human must surround and underlie the brutal. This latter is the spiritual way of thinking. Now, there are two very distinct types or stages in spiritualistic philosophy, and to my next purpose in this lecture is to make their contrast evident. Both types attain the sought-for intimacy of view, but the one attains it somewhat less successfully than the other. The generic term spiritualism, which I began by using merely as the opposite of materialism, thus subdivides into two species, the more intimate one of which is monistic, and the less intimate dualistic. The dualistic species is the theism that reached its elaboration in the scholastic philosophy, while the monistic species is the pantheism, spoken of sometimes simply as idealism, and sometimes as post-Kantian or absolute idealism. Dualistic theism is professed as firmly as ever at all Catholic seats of learning, whereas it has of late years tended to disappear at our British and American universities, and to be replaced by a monistic pantheism, more or less open or disguised. I have an impression that ever since T.H. Green's time, absolute idealism has been decidedly in the ascendant at Oxford. It is in the ascendant at my own University of Harvard. Absolute idealism attains, I said, to the more intimate point of view, but the statement needs some explanation. So far as theism represents the world as God's world, and God as what Matthew Arnold called a magnified, non-natural man, it would seem as if the inner quality of the world remained human, and as if our relations with it might be intimate enough. For what is best in ourselves appears then also outside of ourselves, and we and the universe are of the same spiritual species. So far, so good then. And one might consequently ask, what more of intimacy do you require? To which the answer is that to be like a thing is not as intimate a relation as to be substantially fused into it, to form one continuous soul and body with it, and that pantheistic idealism, making us intentively one with God, attains this higher reach of intimacy. The theistic conception, picturing God and his creation as entities distinct from each other, still leaves the human subject outside of the deepest realities in the universe. God is from eternity complete. It says, and sufficient unto himself. He throws off the world by a free act and as an extraneous substance, and he throws off man as a third substance, extraneous to both the world and himself. Between them, God says 1, the world says 2, and man says 3. That is the orthodox theistic view, and orthodox theism has been so jealous of God's glory that it has taken pains to exaggerate everything in the notion of him that could make for isolation and separateness. Page upon page in scholastic books go to prove that God is in no sense implicated by his creative act or involved in his creation. That his relation to the creatures he has made should make any difference to him, carry any consequence, or qualify his being is repudiated as a pantheistic slur upon his self-sufficiency. I said a moment ago that theism treats us and God as of the same species, but from the orthodox point of view, that was a slip of language. God and his creatures are totogenaire distinct in the scholastic theology. They have absolutely nothing in common. Nay, it degrades God to attribute to him any generic nature whatever. He can be classed with nothing. There is a sense, then, in which philosophic theism makes us outsiders and keeps us foreigners in relation to God, in which, at any rate, his connection with us appears as unilateral and not as reciprocal. His action can affect us, but he can never be affected by our reaction. Our relation, in short, is not a strictly social relation. Of course, in common men's religion, the relation is believed to be social, but that is the only one of many differences between religion and theology. This essential dualism of the theistic view has all sorts of collateral consequences. Man being an outsider and a mere subject to God, not his intimate partner, a character of externality invades the field. God is not heart of our heart and reason of our reason, but our magistrate rather, and mechanically to obey his commands, however strange they may be, remains our only moral duty. Conceptions of criminal law have in fact played a great part in defining our relations with him. Our relations with speculative truth shows the same externality. One of our duties is to know truth, and rationalistic thinkers have always assumed it to be our sovereign duty. But in scholastic theism, we find truth already instituted and established without our help, complete apart from our knowing. And the most we can do is to acknowledge it passively and adhere to it. Although such adhesion as ours can make no jot of difference to what is adhered to. The situation here again is radically dualistic. It is not as if the world came to know itself or God came to know himself partly through us, as pantheistic idealists have maintained. But truth exists per se and absolutely by God's grace and decree, no matter who of us knows it or is ignorant, and it would continue to exist unaltered, even though we finite knowers were all annihilated. It has to be confessed that this dualism and lack of intimacy has always operated as a drag and handicap on Christian thought. Orthodox theology has had to wage a steady fight within the schools against the various forms of pantheistic heresy, which the mystical experiences of religious persons, on one hand, and the formal or atheistic superiorities of monism to dualism, on the other, kept producing. God, as intimate soul and reason of the universe, has always seemed to some people a more worthy conception than God as an external creator. So conceived, he appeared to unify the world more perfectly. He made it less finite and mechanical, and, in comparison with such a God, an external creator seemed more like the product of a childish fancy. I have been told by Hindus that the great obstacle to the spread of Christianity in their country is the puerility of our dogma of creation. It has not sweep and infinitely enough to meet the requirements of even the illiterate natives of India. Assuredly, most members of this audience are ready to side with Hinduism in this matter. Those of us who are sexagenarians have witnessed in our own persons one of those gradual mutations of intellectual climate, due to innumerable influences, that make the thought of a past generation seem as foreign to its successor as if it were the expression of a different race of men. The theological machinery that spoke so livingly to our ancestors with its finite age of the world, its creation out of nothing, its juridical morality and eschatology, its relish for rewards and punishments, its treatment of God as an external contriver, an intelligent and moral governor, sounds as odd to most of us as if it were some outlandish, savage religion. The vaster vistas which scientific evolutionism has opened and the rising tide of social democratic ideals have changed the type of our imagination, and the older monarchical theism is obsolete or obsolescent. The place of the divine in the world must be more organic and intimate. An external creator and his institutions may still be verbally confessed at church in the formulas that linger by their mere inertia, but the life is out of them. We avoid dwelling on them. The sincere heart of us is elsewhere. I shall leave cynical materialism entirely out of our discussion as not calling for treatment before this present audience, and I shall ignore old-fashioned dualistic theism for the same reason. Our contemporary mind, having once for all grasped the possibility of a more intimate Weltanschauung, the only options quite worthy of arresting our attention will fall within the general scope of what may roughly be called the pantheistic field of vision, the vision of God as the indwelling divine rather than the external creator, and of human life as part and parcel of that deep reality. As we have found that spiritualism in general breaks into a more intimate and a less intimate species, so the more intimate species itself breaks into two subspecies, of which the one is more monistic, the other more pluralistic in form. I say in form, for our vocabulary gets unmanageable if we don't distinguish between form and substance here. The inner life of things must be substantially akin, anyhow, to the tenderer parts of man's nature in any spiritualistic philosophy. The word intimacy probably covers the essential difference. Materialism holds the foreign in things to be more primary and lasting. It sends us to a lonely corner with our intimacy. The brutal aspects overlap and outwear. Refinement has the more feebler and more ephemeral hold on reality. From a pragmatic point of view, the difference between living against a background of foreignness and one of intimacy means the difference between a general habit of wariness and one of trust. One might call it a social difference, For, after all, the common solstice of us all is the great universe whose children we are. If materialistic, we must be suspicious of this solstice, cautious, tense, on guard. If spiritualistic, we may give way, embrace, and keep no ultimate fear. The contrast is rough enough, and can be cut across by all sorts of other divisions, drawn from other points of view than that of foreignness and intimacy. We have so many different businesses with nature that no one of them yields us an all-embracing clasp. The philosophic attempt is to define nature so that no one's business is left out, so that no one lies outside the door saying, "Where do I come in?" is sure in advance to fail. The most a philosophy can hope for is not to lock out any interest forever. No matter what doors it closes, it must leave other doors open for the interests which it neglects. I have begun by shutting ourselves up to the intimacy and foreignness because that makes so generally interesting a contrast, and because it will conveniently introduce a farther contrast to which I wished this hour to lead. The majority of men are sympathetic. Comparatively, few are cynics because they like cynicism, and most of our existing materialists are such because they think the evidence of facts impels them, or because they find the idealists they are in contact with too private and tender-minded. So, rather than join their company, they fly to the opposite extreme. I therefore propose to you to disregard materialists altogether for the present and to consider the sympathetic party alone. It is normal, I say, to be sympathetic in the sense in which I use the term, not to demand intimate relations with the universe, and not to wish them satisfactory, should be accounted signs of something wrong. Accordingly, when minds of this type reach the philosophic level and seek some unification of their vision, they find themselves compelled to correct that aboriginal appearance of things by which savages are not troubled. That sphinx-like presence, with its breasts and claws, that first bald multifariousness, is too discrepant an object for philosophic contemplation. The intimacy and the foreignness cannot be written down as simply coexisting. An order must be made, and in that order the higher side of things must dominate. The philosophy of the absolute agrees with the pluralistic philosophy, which I am going to contrast with it in these lectures, in that both identify human substance with the divine substance. But whereas absolutism thinks that the said substance becomes fully divine only in the form of totality, and is not its real self in any form but the all-form, the pluralistic view, which I prefer to adopt, is willing to believe that there may ultimately never be an all-form at all, that the substance of reality may never get totally collected, that some of it may remain outside of the largest combination of it ever made, and that a distributive form of reality, the each form, is logically as acceptable and empirically as probable as the all form commonly acquiesced in as so obviously the self-evident thing. The contrast between these two forms of a reality, which we will agree to suppose substantially spiritual, is practically the topic of this course of lectures. You see now what I mean by pantheism's two subspecies? If we give to the monistic subspecies the name of philosophy of the absolute, we may give that of radical empiricism to its pluralistic rival, and it may be well to distinguish them occasionally later by these names, as a convenient way of entering into the study of their differences. I may refer to a recent article by Professor Jacks of Manchester College. Professor Jacks, in some brilliant pages in the Hibbert Journal for last October, studies the relation between the universe and the philosopher who describes and defines it for us. You may assume two cases, he says. Either what the philosopher tells us is extraneous to the universe he is accounting for, an indifferent parasitic outgrowth, so to speak, or the fact of his philosophizing is itself one of the things taken account of in the philosophy and self-induced in the description. In the former case, the philosopher means by the universe everything except what his own presence brings. In the latter case, his philosophy is itself an intimate part of the universe, and may be a part momentous enough to give a different turn to what other parts signify. It may be a supreme reaction of the universe upon itself, by which it rises to self-comprehension. It may handle itself differently in consequence of this event. Now, both empiricism and absolutism bring the philosopher inside and make man intimate, but the one being pluralistic and the other monistic. They do so in differing ways that need much explanation. Let me then contrast the one with the other way of representing the status of the human thinker. For monism, the world is no collection, but one great all-inclusive fact outside of which is nothing. Nothing is its only alternative. When the monism is idealistic, this all-enveloping fact is represented as an absolute mind that makes the partial facts by thinking them, just as we make objects in a dream by dreaming them, or personages in a story by imagining them. To be, on this scheme, is, on the part of a finite thing, to be an object for the absolute, and on the part of the absolute, it is to be the thinker of that assemblage of objects. If we use the word content here, we see that the absolute and the world have an identical content. This absolute is nothing but the knowledge of those objects. The objects are nothing but what the absolute knows. The world and the all-thinker thus compenetrate and soak each other up without residuum. They are but two names for the same identical material, considered now from the subjective and now from the objective point of view. Gedank and Gedaches, as we would say if we were Germans. We philosophers naturally form part of the material on the monistic scheme. The absolute makes us by thinking us, and if we ourselves are enlightened enough to be believers in the absolute, one may then say that our philosophizing is one of the ways in which the absolute is conscious of itself. This is the full pantheistic scheme, the identitat philosophy, the immanence of God in His creation, a conception sublime from its tremendous unity, and yet that unity is incomplete, as closer examination will show. The absolute and the world are one fact, I said, when materially considered. Our philosophy, for example, is not numerically distinct from the absolute's own knowledge of itself, not a duplicate and copy of it. It is the part of that very knowledge, is numerically identical with as much of it as our thought covers. The absolute just is our philosophy, along with everything else that is known, in an act of knowing which, To use the words of my gifted absolutist colleague Royce, forms in its wholeness one luminously transparent conscious moment. But one as we are in this material sense with the absolute substance, that being only the whole of us, and we only the parts of it. Yet, in a formal sense, something like a pluralism breaks out. When we speak of the absolute, we take the one universal known material collectively, or integrally. When we speak of its objects, of our finite selves, etc., we take that same identical material distributively and separately. But what is the use of a thing's being only once if it can be taken twice over? And if being taken in different ways makes different things true of it? As the absolute takes me, for example, I appear with everything else in its field of perfect knowledge. As I take myself, I appear without most other things in my field of relative ignorance, and practical differences result from its knowledge and my ignorance. Ignorance breeds mistake, curiosity, misfortune, pain. For me, I suffer those consequences. The Absolute knows of those things, of course, for it knows me and my suffering. But it doesn't itself suffer. It can't be ignorant, for simultaneous with its knowledge of each question goes its knowledge of each answer. It can't be patient, for it has to wait for nothing, having everything at once in its possession. It can't be surprised. It can't be guilty. No attribute connected with succession can be applied to it, for it is all at once and wholly what it is, with the unity of a single instant, and succession is not of it, but in it, for we are continually told that it is timeless. Things true of the world in its finite aspects, then, are not true of it in its infinite capacity. Qua finite and plural, its accounts of itself to itself are different from what its accounts to itself, qua infinite, and one must be. With this radical discrepancy between the absolute and the relative points of view, it seems to me that almost as great a bar to intimacy between the divine and the human breaks out in pantheism as that which we found in monarchical theism, and hoped that pantheism might not show. We humans are incurably rooted in the temporal point of view. The Eternal's ways are utterly unlike our ways. Let us imitate the All, said that original prospectus of that admirable Chicago quarterly called The Monist. As if we could, either in thought or conduct. We are invincibly parts. Let us talk as we will, and must always apprehend the absolute as if it were a foreign being. This has been A Temporal Point of View. Bertrand Russell, William James, and Frank Thilly on Philosophy. Written by David Christopher Lane. Narrated by Matthew Raftis. Copyright 2019 by David Christopher Lane. Production copyright by David Christopher Lane.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.